city for his internship residency. Then went to 2 years of work in Nigeria for MCC. I think he could probably talk a long time on that experience, serving in the medical area. Then he came back and finished his residency at the University of Iowa, worked at Mercy Hospital till October of 75, or started there in 75. Retired from Towncrest Internal Medicine in 2011, and then retired from being a hospitalist at the University of Iowa just last June 30th of 2017. We're happy to have him here and talk about medicine in the old days.
Well, it's always interesting when we got to plan these meetings and pick some subject to talk, so my fellow board members kind of railroaded me into this. Maybe you can talk about medical care. Some of you probably know stories that I don't know about medical care in the past, and so I would welcome if you have something you think could be interesting for the group to hear. I'd be glad to have you share that, so you can be thinking about that. The railroad came to Kelowna in 1879. So the town was platted in 1879. It was farmland before that. And in that same year, people apparently got in action, because in 1879 there was a general store, a dry goods store, and a lumber yard here. And by the next year, a drugstore, a hardware store, post office, and 2 saloons were here. And in 1980 was when the first doctor came. I'm going to jump to just Washington County history in general for a little bit to give you a broader picture of what was happening back in those days. The first settlers came to Washington County in 1837. And the town of Washington was established in 1839. It's kind of interesting how people started moving in. Actually, in 1839, there was a doctor arrived in Brighton, Dr. Mallet. And around 1839 or 1840, another Dr. Horace Carley came to Brighton. He wasn't there very long and he died. And he's reported to be the second person buried in the town of Brighton. Doctors are subject to dying too, it seems. By 1849, there were 12 families in the town of Washington, and by 1857, there were 2,000 people. So that was basically in a matter of 18 years. 5 churches were established by that time, and 2 more were in progress. The railroad came to Washington in 1858, and that was considered a big event for the development of the town. And that was 21 years before the railroad came to Kelowna. So that part of the county was kind of far ahead of us. And as probably most of you know, the town of Richmond was laid out in 1840. So around that same time, and the population of Richmond had grown big long before Kelowna existed. So 1840 was the first doctor in Washington, George Stone. 1841, Dr. Parker and Rousseau came. In 1842, Dr. John Hamilton came to Richmond, and he was also a preacher at Snake Hollow Church, it says in one place. So, the population of the English River Township, which would be Richmond, Kelowna area, in 1857 was 1,435 people. Things were happening in those days. There's a history of Washington County by Mr. Burrell, published in 1908. This is what he says of Kelowna around the turn of the century. Kelowna is a lively stock shipping point, crowding Westchester closely. The country all around is unsurpassed. Farmers gather in enormous barn and buy and sell stock. Market day is as lively as anything in that line in a big city in Ireland. The town is incorporated in every respect up to date. Big Fire, that at the time seemed calamity pure and simple, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. It is now well built, beautifully built. Enormous volume of business is done there. In the old days, the stock amusement was chasing wolves on horseback. The men using Roosevelt big sticks, I assume that'd be guns. It was more exciting than pony polo. In the southern belt, the settlers are largely Bohemian, who have a passion for the land and hard workers and savings, and all are getting rich. In the north part is a large settlement of Amish or Mennonite. Excellent people, admirable farmers. They are peculiar in dress, plain as Quakers. Indeed, being Quakers modified by habitat. The young women are frequently very pretty in their demure costume. In time, these fine people will slough that uniform and pass just as Americans and no better anywhere. Well, some of us have sloughed the uniform perhaps, but others haven't. So, doctors came to Richmond before Kelowna because that was the town, and there was one interesting character reported from the town of Richmond being a Dr. Nelson Van Patten. He liked to sleep on the ground in the timber, presumably in the warm weather. He was rather social, in quotes, visiting residents whether or not owners were home, and if hungry, simply helped himself to what food was available. The last doctor in Richmond was in 1898, and that was a Dr. Josiah Chittum. He also ran the post office. In 1908, he was one of the few people in Richmond to own an automobile. Left in 1914, and Richmond hasn't had a doctor since. So we'll go next to the Kelowna doctors. Dr. Flowers is, and I should say that sources of information vary a little bit, so I hope this is correct, but some lists may be just a little different, but in general, this would be likely what happened. 1980, Dr. Flowers came to town, was the first doctor. He was here for 2 years, sold out to Dr. Franklin Round. In 1885, B.F. Allen came. Dr. Allen was born in Daytonville in 1857, grew up in that area, went to medical school at the University of Iowa, graduated 1883. He reportedly went to South Dakota for practice initially, and then he went to Morse, Iowa, found a sweetheart there and married her, and then moved to Kelowna and started practicing in 1885. And he was here until approximately 1902, so he was a long-time doctor here. Really one of the longest in that time period. 1887, Dr. John Ritter came from Richmond, was here until 1899 and then left. In 92, J.E. Wells came from Richmond, later went to Wellman in 1907. In the 1890s, Dr. Kaiser came and was here quite a number of years. I.S. Bigelow and L. Hammer came around that time. I don't think those stayed very long. 1903, Dr. Jones, W.W. Jones, left in 1910. 1910, Dr. Eli Stutzman came and was here until 1917. 1911, Dr. J.H. Wolfe until 1918. 1917, Chester Denard bought out Dr. Stutzman, stayed for 18 months. Dr. John Fry came that same year, and he was here for 30 years. And so when I ask people who they remember about doctors, his name frequently comes up. 1920, Dr. Rock J.E. Rock left after a couple months. Dr. D.H. Osborne stayed 3 years. Dr. Tilden, 1922 to 31. Stephen Ware was here 1931 to 1944. And then doctors that I'm sure you all remember, Dr. Sattler and Dr. Beckman. And then the last one I have listed here is Dwight Kauffman, came in 1983. So some stories of that I can share with you. I don't have a lot, so this is where if you can add something to the stories of these Kona doctors, I'd welcome them. In this History of Washington County, published in 1908, they talk about some of the doctors in the Washington area, and I think that what I'm going to talk about here would be similar to what was happening in the Kelowna area back in those days. Dr. Rousseau came here from Kentucky in 1944. It says he was a very notable man, eccentric, humorous, full of drive, energy, and individuality, did an immense business for many years. As late as 73, he, with Dr. Fraser and Burroughs, organized the Washington County Medical Society. A giant in body and powerful in mind, he was a mark for caricature, and Burroughs was exquisitely funny and happy in taking him off, meaning talking about him, especially depicting Rousseau's impatience with Dr. Rice, a homeopathy. I don't know if you know what homeopathy is. It's I'm an allopathic doctor. We use medicines in standard doses to treat diseases. The homeopaths believe that you can treat a disease with a medicine that, if given in a large dose, would cause the disease. But if you give it in a little dose, it'll treat the disease. The allopathic doctors think that's all a little strange. So to explain it, if there's something like milk of magnesia that you take in a large dose and it gives you diarrhea, then if you take just a little bit when you have diarrhea, then it should stop the diarrhea. That's homeopathic, means like. Homeo is like. Big pills have no use for little pills, and so I'm a big pill doctor and the homeopath's a little pill doctor. Burroughs could mimic tones, grimaces, motions to perfection, all kindly done, of course, but with infinite humorous appreciation. Burroughs and Dr. William McClellan were great friends and an opposite temperament, tastes, habits. As quinine in the 40s was $4 per ounce, these two mixed up a preparation of arsenic that was just as good and cheap. They tried it on Dr. Miller and Dr. McClellan with their consent, and it did not kill them. The compound was used habitually, and medical fees came down 50%, so it was a lot cheaper. They put cholera patients on hot bricks a la Montezuma on live coals, and it worked like a charm. He goes on to talk about how there's various schools of medicine. Dr. Kilgore introduced the eclectic system, Dr. Parker homeopathy, Dr. Miller cold water cure, packing, magnetic rubbing. But osteopathy, hypnotism, or suggestion in Christian Science are cults that came later. So back in those days, the education for doctors wasn't very well standardized, and so all sorts of things were happening out there. Medical schools in the mid 1800s were not at all in agreement on how doctors should be educated, so some people could go to, basically if you went to put in your time with another doctor, then you could get a certificate that you were a doctor. By the early 1900s, there was a report came out that said there's way too many medical schools and they're way too poorly organized, and so around that time is when things got more organized and people had to go to college before they went to medical school. Dr. Stone and McClellan Rousseau rode horses over the country before roads and bridges and fences. So back in, in 1850s, there weren't roads yet. One of the complaints of the Richmond people about town of Kelowna in 1879 was here was a town that had no road to it. And it got wet and the fields were soggy, and so it was hard to get to town. Eventually they got organized and got some roads built. So these guys rode horses. The latter formed the cavalryman's habits of sleeping on his horse, feet in the stirrup, coming home. If the horse stopped suddenly, pitching him onto the pommel, he knew a rattlesnake was coiled in the trail. And apparently rattlesnakes were common then, and they say that one of the best ways to take care of the rattlesnakes was burn prairie grass. Often he rode his horse 80 miles a day. He had as much confidence in his horse as the deacon has in his pastor, so both dared sleep in the saddle in the pew. Dr. Allen, in the Kelowna Centennial book, they a nice article about him. So, in those days, there were no oiled or graveled roads, only dirt that became mud in bad weather. When snow blocked the roads in the winter, sled and sleighs took to the open fields. There was no telephone. When making a call in the country, Dr. Allen would get word physically to another patient. At that time, his office was at the rear of the drugstore he owned, south of Edmondson Store. The registered pharmacist as well as the doctor, Dr. Allen was on call any hour of the day or night, keeping 2 teams of horses so that one would always be fresh. So he'd be ready to go. Much of his practice was among the Amish, for whom he had great respect and often said, their word is as good as their bond. Because he never hesitated to answer any call at any time, his health broke. During the winter of 1900, he got bad pneumonia, and he took some time off to recover, but apparently didn't feel like continuing being a doctor, so he sold his practice to Dr. Kaiser of Wyndham. And kind of interesting that Wyndham would have a doctor. He went on to do business things in Kelowna and actually lived quite a few more years. It says in here, talks about when he, after his retirement, he built a new home in the north part of Kelowna in 1910, which is the house that I was talking to Evie Yoder Miller today, and she said, well, that was my house that he lived in. Yoder Funeral Home house was the one Dr. Allen built. Eli Stutzman was one of the doctors in the list, and I tried to find stuff on him and couldn't. I called Roger Stutzman of Hills and asked him if he knew anything about this. Well, this Eli Stutzman would have been his father, Eldon Stutzman's first cousin. Eli Stutzman's father was also Eli Stutzman, and lived here in the Kelowna area. I think he started out in the Amish church. He was apparently quite an entrepreneur and had lots of stuff going on, and had business in North Dakota and Yakima, Washington, along with lots of things going on here. And the Amish bishop talked to him. Apparently, they didn't approve exactly of whatever. But Eli decided that he was going to change things, so he changed his Stutzman Z name to S and left the Amish. And Roger says he can remember this, Dr. Eli coming to visit his dad up until the 50s he died. Eli went to the University of Iowa for a while, and then was in the Barbara Hostetler book, it says he graduated from Ohio in ear, nose, and throat and was a Methodist. there is a diary by a lady named Emma Miller. She's in Wally Fisher's extended family. He had these diaries. She was the daughter of David Miller, and in 1913 she wrote these diaries. She was not well, and so there's the entries are very brief. They don't tell a lot about what happened, but the doctor would come frequently, every few weeks to a month, to her house to visit her. And then in October of 1913, her grandmother got sick, and so from the 1st of October to the 25th of October, the doctor came almost every day. There was about one day that he didn't come. Dr. Kaiser, Stutzman, and Wolf are the ones mentioned who came to visit. And this Dr. Wolf was the son-in-law of Dr. Allen. He was here for a number of years, and then he moved to Iowa City and practiced in Iowa City. So, anybody got any stories you want to tell about, family stories you got about interesting thing with the doctors?
I think it was Dr. Ware that attended my birth in a farmhouse, 1939, and I don't remember back that far too much, but I think that Dr. Ware was the guy that had a Model A with tractor tires on all four wheels to go through the roads. I believe that was the doctor. And I saw a picture of that one time, unless it was another doctor, but roads were all mud, I guess.
So if you didn't hear what he said, Dr. Ware delivered him at home. This is Lynn Graber talking. Dr. Ware delivered him at home, and Dr. Ware had a Model A that had tractor tires on it, so he could get about and travel through the mud.
Well, I didn't realize either, but he delivered me too.
Dr. Ware?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a check that Dad gave me $45. And he called the next morning to see how Mom was, and he said something about baby, and I said, he's living yet?
Dr. Ware took my tonsils out upstairs above Kelowna Savings Bank in his office there one afternoon.
Put you to sleep, or?
No, I just sat in a chair.
Nyle,
Yes.
you reported on the doctors in the Kelowna area and east and south. What would you have to say about Wellman and Dr. Miller? Venus Miller.
Well, there was Enos Miller. There was actually probably doctors in the Daytonville-Wellman area long before Kelowna. And Daytonville, of course, was the big town early on, and then Wellman, the railroad made Wellman. Yeah, one of the longtime doctors in Wellman area was the Millers, Enos Miller, and then his son Jay, and subsequently his son Dennis. So.
Dr. Enos delivered me in our house out there north of Wellman,
Okay,
1931,
yeah.
and took my tonsils out in his office when I was about 13 or 14.
All right. Well, a little picture of what was happening in the medical world in the 1850s. My slides are a little out of order here, don't worry about it. In the 1850s, Louis Pasteur studied. He was a doctor, scientist guy, and decided that microorganisms, probably like bacteria, were probably causing disease, and that was a strange idea. By 1867, Joseph Lister was a doctor who thought that hand washing and using things that would disinfect would prevent disease. One of the things that was happening was in big city hospitals, doctors would make their rounds in the morgue in the beginning of the day and do an autopsy on somebody, and then they would go out to the hospital ward and inject their patients and not wash their hands. And Joseph Lister was among those that felt like that was contributing to disease, that the people in the hospital were then getting sick from the doctors examining him. And he showed that hand washing and using carbolic acid or other antiseptic things could be helpful in preventing disease. In the 1850s, 1854, there was a cholera epidemic in Brighton. Cholera was something that happened around in various places. A traveler came from St. Louis. There was apparently cholera in St. Louis. And a case broke out in a little girl. They had a funeral and a wake, and everybody that was at the wake got sick with cholera. And this thing spread as an epidemic in the town, and people became very fearful and panicked. And some of the doctors observed that everybody that was fearful got sick and died. There were 25 people ended up dying, which was approximately 10% of the population at that time. So it was a significant illness. Malaria was out and about in those days. It was a problem. It was called, the disease that it caused was often called ague, A-G-U-E. And people didn't realize it was caused by malaria and mosquitoes, but the suspicion was that bad vapors from the wetlands were what caused this ague. And quinine was the medicine to treat it, and it actually worked, so it was a good medicine for that illness. Smallpox was out and about in the newspaper in February of 1872 reported that smallpox was crawling toward Brighton from Mount Pleasant, and in the news article it recommended vaccination. Vaccination for smallpox was started in the late 1700s, so that was one of the things that was useful and helpful. Scarlet fever was another disease that's caused by streptococcal bacteria, and it is quite contagious, and epidemics of that would happen every few years. Typhoid fever was another thing that, another disease that was out and about. And one of the doctors did recognize that maybe typhoid fever had something to do with drainage and so on, and so he recommended that people not harvest ice from ponds that drain water out of the city. Basically, your sewer water goes out in the pond, and then it freezes, and then you go out and cut the ice, haul it back in, and perpetuate disease in a rather significant way. In the around 1865, the fee schedule from the Washington doctors, they kind of drew up an agreement that apparently they all followed, and this was listed as lasting for 50 years. So if you went to their office and got a prescription, they charge you 75 cents to $1. If they visited your house, it would be $1.50, and you may have to pay 75 cents for mileage charge. Baby delivery was $10 to $20, but if they used forceps or did manipulations, you might have to pay $20 or $30 more. And an operation would be $25 to $100, but if it was a big operation, $100 to $500. I would think $500 was a rather significant fee for those people, because someplace I noticed that for a couple dollars an acre you could buy land. So that would be quite a hospital bill. An interesting fact is that Washington Hospital is the first rural hospital in the whole United States, built in 1912. Now there were city hospitals, of course, big city hospitals, but the first rural hospital, 1912, Washington County. All right. I'll go on to medications that were available in those days. Quinine was an extract of tree bark, and that was figured out in the 1600s. So in the 1800s, when these doctors were there, it was easily available. It was kind of expensive, as that one story I told you about, but it did work for malaria, and it was often prescribed for stomach troubles and various ailments. Digitalis is an extract of the flower foxglove, so that was available. Cocaine was found in 1860 from cocoa leaves, and cocaine, of course, was a good anesthetic. Opium, poppy seed extract, was easily available in the 1800s, and with a little cooking and refining, and morphine and codeine were part of what came out of opium. Opium was a common ingredient in many medications that the doctors prescribe, and you hear in the news these days the opioid crisis we're facing now. Well, back in those days they had an opioid crisis too, because opium was kind of a favorite medication for people, and it became a problem, particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was recognized as a problem. Salicylic acid was started in 1874. This was aspirin-like medicine that's extract from willow bark. And then the anatropine was a nightshade medication available in the 1800s. And these things were actually had pharmaceutical medicinal properties that were good. The first synthetic drug was antipyrine, made in 1880. 1899 was aspirin. And then in 1911, salvarsan was a medicine made with arsenic that was recognized as being useful in treating syphilis. One of the hazards was, since arsenic is in it, it could be poisonous if you treat too much. But that was sort of considered the beginning of making medicines to treat diseases. And so this is really a 1900 or a phenomenon of the 1900s. In 1935, we had sulfa come on the market, and in 1940, penicillin. In 1969, when I was in medical school, if I look now, I didn't think about it at the time, but you look back, there was probably only about 12 or 15 useful antibiotics at that time. We thought we had pretty good armamentarium, but the explosion of making of medicine since then is really remarkable, and we have, I don't know, I haven't counted up exactly, well over 100 antibiotics available now. But interestingly, you hear the talk about antibiotics are wearing out their usefulness because of development of resistance. So the germ world out there is pretty interesting. As I mentioned, smallpox vaccine was available in the 1700s, rabies vaccine was developed in 1885, and tetanus and diphtheria antitoxins were developed in 1890. So those things were available to the early doctors and were useful things. So a little switch to home remedies. That list of medications that I gave is pretty limited compared to what we have available now. And so, same as now, we have a whole host of companies making supplements and medicines aside from our standard prescription medications. The same thing was true back in those days. And home remedies, people had developed plants, herbs that they could use, aromatic oils, cod liver oil, vinegar, whiskey, onion plasters. there's a whole host of things that people used for their home remedies. And looking through my stuff and thinking about this, I found this book, The Cottage Physician, published in 1899. And in the opening preface here it says, in view of the fact that science and practice of medicine have made such wonderful advancements during the past few years, no one physician is any longer equally well versed in all departments. Successful physician of today really excels in some special branch of his profession. I was just kind of intrigued how in 1899 he felt like they made lots of advances. So this is a rather detailed book. It's intended for people for home use. It's big. It has both standard remedies and homeopathy remedies for what may ail you. One that I found interesting here is listed for inflammation of the stomach. It's known by pain in the epigastric area increased when anything is taken into the stomach, together with vomiting, hiccup, rapid pulse, general prostration attended by fever and anxiety. Produced by poisons of various kinds taken in the stomach is arsenic, corrosive sublimate by food of an improper nature. So here's the treatment. The following is a good solvent mixture where gallstones are known to be present. Castile soap, 2 grams. I'm not sure how much that is, maybe a little bit. Melt by heat in a half pint of water. Add spirits of turpentine and ether of each 2 grams. Take a tablespoon 3 times a day. Castile soap and turpentine. How to cure what ails you. So, books were published. There was a doctor down in the Keokuk area that was kind of famous because he put together a medicine box for people and had an instruction list with it, and would tell them which pills to take when they were sick. A little advancement beyond that is this this collection. This is from our museum, and this was put out by the Iowa City Domestic Medicine Company in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This was Dr. A.L. Pollard was the head of the company. There was an article in 1903 Press Citizen that talked about how the company was moving to a new place in Iowa City because business was so good. And they say that they have all the good medicines that were available here in these pills for you. They have a book. You look up your symptoms and then it tells you which pill to take. Now, unfortunately, they just have these bottles labeled, number 39, number 40, number 41, and so on. So it doesn't say what's actually in each bottle.
But all those pills look exactly alike. Got the same little duty that.
No, they're not all alike.
Oh, pretty nice.
Here's a big white one, and here's a little round brown one.
Okay.
Then there's another little round brown one, and another little round brown one. But anyway, they apparently were popular in their day for, well, if you're sick at home and you look in the book, you've got something to do. This is interesting. And the other thing on these bottles, some of them got a stamp on them, which I would presume they ran out of the original bottle, and so they ordered a refill, and they mailed the bottle with a stamp on it. This apparatus is a gift from Wilbur and Helen Yoder. Wilbur's grandmother had it. It's basically a little shock device. You put batteries in this part. This wire was connected in here, and you turn it on and hold this in one hand and rub it here or back here in your back or on your head or wherever your aches and pains are, and it's supposed to cure what ails you. this cottage physician book says that this electric therapy is good stuff because you don't have to take pills that make you sick. And interestingly enough, you know, the physical therapists still use transcutaneous stimulators, which is the very same thing, a little shock box to help treat pain syndromes. It's 15 years ago probably, I went to the state fair, and the guy at the fair booth had one of these things. Modern day, of course, put your batteries in it and shock yourself and get treated. So, the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is another form of therapy that people did when they didn't want to pay for the doctor to come. I'm going to read from a paper that was presented by a Dr. Kauffman in Pennsylvania before the American Philosophical Society, 1889. And he's describing folk medicine of the Pennsylvania Germans. So he talks about the fact that they're rural people and they don't always have good access to medical care, and they may keep herbs and plants in a certain way to use those for treatments. And then he goes on to say this: among the less intelligent and truly illiterate prevail the practices of laying on of hands, breathing upon the affected part, charms, incantations, exorcisms, making passes with the hands and crosses with the index finger at the same time, pronouncing the name of Jesus and coupling therewith some act in his life, besides various other mysterious actions seemingly for the purpose of impressing the credulous and the superstitious. Such practices are still indulged in, and when a patient suffers from an insignificant disorder which in due time disappears, the restoration to health is accredited to the operator and consequently adds to his already established reputation. Another form of cure is by transference of disease, either to some person or animal, so the inanimate or to an inanimate object. Sometimes the disease is cast out at a specific time upon the fulfillment of certain injunctions. And he goes on to describe things in big detail. What he's talking about is this, what's described as powwowing or brocking. I have some recollection that at one day at IMS when I was a student, I discussed with another student that subject. They brought it up. I didn't know anything about it. My family didn't talk about it. We didn't know anything about it. And it's just something that's kind of fascinated me over the years. So I have thought more about it and read more about it in preparation for this. And one of the books I read is this Powwowing Among the Pennsylvania Dutch by David Crable. It was published in 2007. David Crable was a PhD student who went out and talked to lots of people in Pennsylvania about powwowing and brocking, and put this book together for his thesis. And when he started out, he was under the impression that nobody practiced it in Pennsylvania anymore, that it was something that happened in the past. And he actually found that there were people who were still practicing this. So, and it involves basically rituals of prayer. The powwower may do certain movements with their hands. Sometimes they touch people, sometimes they don't. They have certain things they say. There are some strange things involved too, like this George Homan was from the 1800s, and he wrote a book. He wrote down some of his cures. A good remedy to stop bleeding. And you say this: blood thou must stop until Virgin Mary bring forth another son. Repeat these words 3 times. Blood thou must stop until Virgin Mary bring forth another son. And how to cure a burn? Then you would say this: 3 holy men went out walking, they did bless the heat and the burning. They blessed the night. They blessed that it might not increase. They blessed that it might quickly cease. One of the things that people who do brocking sometimes do is to use a string to measure the person that's sick. There's various descriptions of how this measurement is done. One is to measure the head, and then, or measure your foot from the heel to the toe, and then your height should be 7 times that. And if it's not, then you have an illness and you need some treatment. Sometimes the measurement of the string is by measuring an illness, you define it, and then you can do something with it. And so you wrap the string around an egg and put the egg in the stove and burn it, or bury it, or do various things like that. So there's a whole spectrum of things that brocking doctors can do. I've asked people in this community what they know about it, and most of the stories I hear go back to people my age's grandparents or earlier. And like most communities, there is some acceptance of it and significant disagreement that it's that they feel like it's not a good thing to be doing. I talked to a fellow from Ohio. His nephew was taken by his mother to be treated by a brocking doctor. So that's a little further down. I have a family story here that unfortunately I missed the boat, that Laura Lee's mother is dead, so I can't ask her any questions. But this is the story that's come out from her generation. Laura Lee had a daughter, Joanne, who was about 3 years old. She was taken to Grandpa and Grandma's house to babysit. Laura Lee's younger sister is 10 years younger, so she was probably 8-10 years old when this happened, and she remembers it very clearly, that Joanne was not well. What her illness was is unclear. She probably had fever, stomach ache, crying, something. Grandmother and grandfather carried out their brocking treatment. They measured her with the string and they prayed for her, and she seemed better. And Laura Lee and her husband came home, and they were told that their daughter had been prayed for, and Laura Lee's husband said, "Don't ever do that again." This is the dilemma that's surrounded this kind of treatment for years, is that some people view it as being good. And brocking doctors, according to what's written about them, most of them say you have to believe in God, you have to be a Christian, the practitioner has to believe in God, and the person who's healed has to believe in God for it to work. The critics are concerned that there's other kinds of spirits involved and that we shouldn't be dealing in that. So, any questions? Marvin?
I found on Wikipedia, if you Google about powwowing and go to Wikipedia, I found a very good article on what you're talking about right now. I like it. It says most of the things you said.
Yeah. Yeah, if you put in, if you just put in powwow,
No.
then you'll get all kinds of Indian powwow stuff. If you put in powwow medical, then you get these stories. And one of the concerns of the Christian powwowers is that New Age kind of people want to adopt these things without the Christian part of it. So there's all kinds of things happen, and there are, you know, people who do hexes and that sort of thing in the past. There's stories about that. So bad things do happen too. Yes.
Were these practices of powwowing and rocking, was that something the Anabaptists brought with them from Europe?
Yes. That seems to be the conclusion. This powwowing and rocking is a phenomenon that's mostly among Pennsylvania Dutch people. And some of the non-Anabaptist Pennsylvania Dutch have some similar practices, but yes, it's felt that these were brought from Europe, and there's reports of rocking being done in Pennsylvania as early as 1750, so that was clearly something that was brought over. One of my Amish friends, when I asked him about this, he said something about the Catholic ritual, doing something with an egg. And I answered him that I didn't think the Catholics had anything involved in that. But then I did a little more reading, and there may be some thought that some of this stuff with eggs and trying to transfer disease to something else is more of a follow-up from, you know, before we were Anabaptists, we were Catholics. And so they may have transferred from then too. So it's something that comes from old. Powwowing has nothing to do with the American Indians. It's not related to them.
Again, that article said it was more than just, it didn't even mention Anabaptists or Mennonites. All of the German population brought it, including Lutherans.
Yes.
And refers back to the thing you said about pre-Reformation Catholics.
Yep. Yep.
Did you ever hear anything about diffusible tonic?
Oh, I got some more sitting here. John Mark King gave me a collection of bottles to show here. These are bottles that he's dug up in his job as an excavator. And so it's kind of very interesting stuff. Here's J. Hostetler's stomach bitters. So I Googled J. Hostetler's stomach bitters. And he was a doctor in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the 1800s, and he first put this stuff on the market in 1853. It has 47% alcohol in it. And Dr. Hostetler felt that was important because it needed to preserve the medicinal ingredients. Just one bottle creates an appetite, forces off impure bile, purifies the system. Read an ad. If one was good, two were better. 2 bottles cures bad livers and lends strength and cheerfulness. There wasn't really much of very important stuff in it besides the alcohol. Here's an interesting poem that was used to advertise it. You can come read it if you wish. Hostetler sweetened the alcohol with sugar, to which he added a few aromatic oils, anise, coriander, and vegetable buffers, cinchona, gentian, etc., to give it a medicinal flavor. Now, it says that the Civil War troops liked this medicine very much. They thought it helped their stomachs. And train car loads of Hostetler's bitters were delivered to the appreciative troops. Over 6,000 bottles of Hostetler's stomach bitters were sold daily in the United States and abroad. And from the 1850s up until the 1900s, it was actively marketed. Now, John Mark, this one thing that I saw says that they have a bottle they'll sell for $875. I mean, it's an empty bottle too. Here's Dr. Peters, blood vitalizer. Dr. Peters was a doctor from Pennsylvania also. And this, see what it was advertised as, the side of the box says bronchitis, catarrh, coughs, colds, ulcers, pimples, humors on the face, ringworm, salt ream, cankerous humors, cancer, scrofulous, kidney complaints, female weakness, pains in the side, so it should be good for what ails you. Here's Lydia Pinkman's medicine. Lydia Pinkman was a woman who, she founded this company. I don't think she was a doctor, but she was a businesswoman, certainly. And she was, this was aimed at treating women's menstrual complaints. And so this was one of the things it did have in it is black cohosh, which is a plant extract that's still, you can buy it in supplements today at the drugstore if you go look for it. And it's one of the things that has kind of a hormonal-like effect in people, natural hormone, and good stuff. So this was very famous. Here's Himalaya, the Kola compound, K-O-L-A, nature's cure for asthma. And this was an extract of a kola plant from West Africa. And actually this stuff should have worked, probably as good as anything that they had in those days, because it has a theophylline-like compound, kola plant does. And this is a far better treatment for asthma than this cottage physician book says for asthma. Here's Healy Bigelow Kickapoo Indian Oil, which is Kickapoo Indian Oil is camphor, myrrh, capsaicin, oil of cloves, oil of sassafras, sulfuric, ether, water, opium. 1 grain, and alcohol, 60%. I talked about Dr. Allen being a long-term doctor here in Kelowna. Here's a bottle that says B.F. Allen, M.D., Kelowna, Iowa. So he was a doctor and a pharmacist, but he also had his own medicine bottles. Kind of interesting. Well, that's all I had. Thank you very much for coming. We do have cookies and beverages to share with you, so